Good morning and a very warm welcome to this, our next podcast in our series on the various books of the Psalms. We extend our greetings in our Lord's name to you, your loved ones and all your fellowship, wherever you may be. May our thoughts, our words and our deeds be forever acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. This week we come to the big one, Psalm 119. Alleluia! Blessed are the blameless in the way, who walk in the law of the Lord. Blessed are those who seek his testimonies. They seek him with their whole heart. For the workers of iniquity have not walked in his ways. I have commanded you to keep your precepts with all diligence. My ways are directed for good, to keep your judgments. Then I will not be ashamed when I look upon all your commandments. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, with uprightness of heart, when I have learnt of your righteous judgments. I will keep your statutes. Do not forsake me altogether. How can a young man make his way right when he keeps your words? I seek you with my whole heart. Do not let me stray from your commandments. I have hidden your word in my heart, that I might not sin against you. Blessed art thou, O Lord. Teach me your judgments. With my lips I have declared all the judgments of your mouth. In the way of your testimonies I have been nourished as with all riches. I will meditate on your commandments and understand your ways. I will meditate in your judgments. I will not depart from your words. Repay your servant. I will live and keep your words. I will open my eyes that I may behold thy wondrous works out of your law. I am a stranger in the earth. Do not hide your commandments from me. My soul has longed to desire your judgments at all times. You have rebuked the proud. Cursed are they that wander from your commandments. Turn away from me reproach and contempt, because I have sought your testimonies. For princes sit and speak against me, but your servant will rejoice in your judgments. For your testimonies are my study, and your judgments are my meditation. My soul cleaves to the ground. Quicken me according to your word. I have declared my ways, and you have heard me. Teach me your judgments. Make me understand the way of your judgments, that I will rejoice in your wonders. My soul is consumed with iniquity. Confirm me in your word. Remove from me the way of unrighteousness, and have mercy on me in your law. I have kept the way of truth, and have not transgressed your judgments. I have stuck to your testimonies, O Lord. Do not put me to shame. I have run in the way of your commandments, when you enlarge my heart. Teach me, O Lord, the way of your statutes, and I will seek it forever. Give me understanding, and I will search out your law, and I will keep it with my whole heart. Lead me in the path of your commandments, for I delight in them. Incline my heart to your testimonies, and not to covetousness. Turn away my eyes from beholding vanity. Quicken me in your way. Establish your word to your servant, that I may fear you. Turn away my reproach, which I have feared, for your judgments are good. Behold, I have longed for your precepts. Quicken me in your righteousness. Your mercy, O Lord, has come to me, your salvation according to your word. I will answer those who taunt me with words, for I have hoped in your word. Do not withhold the word of truth from my mouth, for I have hoped in your judgments. I will keep your law forever, forever and ever. I walked at liberty because I sought your commandments. They spoke of your testimonies before kings, and I was not ashamed. I meditated in your commandments, which I love exceedingly. I lifted up my hands to your commandments, which I loved, and they rejoiced in your judgments. Remember your word unto your servant, in whom you have made me hope. You made supplication to me in my affliction, for your word hath quickened me. I was exceedingly proud, yet I did not depart from your law. I have remembered your judgments from everlasting, O Lord, and I was gladdened. I am filled with indignation because of the sinners that forsake your law. Your judgments are my song in the place of my habitation. I have remembered your name in the night, O Lord, and I have kept your law. This is done to me because I have sought your judgment. I have said, O Lord, that I would keep your law. I have sought your face with all my heart. Be merciful to me according to your word. I have considered your ways and turned my feet to your testimonies. I have prepared myself and have not been moved, that I might keep your commandments. The cords of sinners have entangled me, and your law has not passed over me. At midnight I will explain to you the judgments of your righteousness. I am a sharer of all those who fear you, of those who keep your commandments. The earth is full of your mercy, O Lord. Teach me your judgments. You have dealt bountifully with your servant, O Lord, according to your word. Teach me goodness and discipline and knowledge, for I have believed your commandments. Before I was brought low, I was rebuked, and so I kept your word. You are good, O Lord. In your goodness, teach me your statutes. The iniquity of the proud is multiplied upon me, but I will search out your commandments with my whole heart. Their heart is curdled like milk, but I will study your law. It is good for me that you humble me, that I may learn your statutes. The law of your mouth is better to me than much gold and silver. Your hands have made me and fashioned me. Mold me, and I will learn your commandments. Those who fear you will see me and be glad, because I have hoped in your word. I know, O Lord, that your judgments are righteous, and that you have afflicted me in truth. Let your mercy be shown to your servant, that I might plead with you according to your word. Your tender mercies come to me, and I live, for your law is my meditation. The proud are ashamed, for they have wronged me, but I will rejoice in your commandments. They that fear you shall return unto me, they that know your testimonies. Let my heart be blameless in your judgment, that I may not be ashamed. My soul faints for your salvation, and in your word have I hoped. My eyes fail at your word, saying, when will you call on me? For I am become like a donkey in the pasture. I have not passed over your judgments. How many are the days of your servant? When will you save me from my persecutors? The wicked have spoken against me in my youth, but not according to your law, O Lord. All your commandments are truth, and they have persecuted me wrongfully. Help me. They made me but a short time upon the earth, but I did not forsake your commandments. According to your loving kindness, quicken me that I may keep the testimonies of your mouth. Forever, O Lord, your word is settled in heaven. The truth is from generation to generation. You have founded the earth, and it abides. By your commandment the day abides, for all the world is your servant. If I had not found encouragement in your law, I would have died in my sorrow. I will never forget your judgments, for in them you have given me life, O Lord. I am yours. Save me, for I have sought your judgments. The wicked have oppressed me to destroy me. I have gathered your testimonies. I have seen the end of all things. Your commandment is very broad. How I love your law, O Lord! It is my meditation all day long. You make me wise through your commandment, for it is mine forever. I have gathered together all my teachers, for your testimonies are my meditation. I have gathered together the elders, for I have sought your commandments. I have refrained my feet from every evil way, that I might keep your word. I have not turned aside from your judgments, for you have made me a law. Your words are sweet to my taste, more than honey, and honey to my mouth. I have learnt from your precepts. Therefore I hate every way of unrighteousness, for you have made the law for me. I know that your word is a lamp to my feet and a light for my path. I have kept your righteous judgments. I am greatly afflicted. O Lord, quicken me according to your word. Let the desire of my mouth be acceptable, O Lord, and teach me your judgments. My soul is in my hands forever, and I have not strayed from your law. The wicked have laid a snare for me, but I have not erred from your commandments. I have inherited your testimonies forever, and they are the joy of my heart. I have inclined my heart to abide by your judgments forever as a reward. I have hated the lawless and loved your law. You are my helper and my defender. In your word have I hoped. Depart from me, you wicked men, and I will seek the commandments of my God. Give me understanding according to your word, that I might live, and let me not be ashamed of my hope. Help me, and I will be saved, and I will meditate on your judgments forever. You have destroyed all those who stray from your judgments, for I have remembered my wrongdoings. You remove all the wicked of the earth like slag. Therefore I love your rules. Give me rest from my fear of you, for I am afraid of your judgments. I have done what is just and righteous. Do not deliver me up to the wicked. Receive your servant for good, and do not let the proud slander me. My eyes fail for your salvation, and for the word of your righteousness. Deal with your servant according to your loving kindnesses, and teach me your judgments. I am your servant, make me wise, that I may know your testimonies. It is time to do good to the Lord. They have delighted in your law. Therefore I love your commandments above gold or topaz. Therefore I have observed all your commandments. I hate every wrong way. Your testimonies are wonderful. Therefore my soul searches them out. The entrance of your words gives light, making the simple wise. I opened my mouth and breathed, because I longed for your commandments. Look upon me and have mercy on me, according to the judgment of those who love your name. Direct my steps according to your word, and let no iniquity have dominion over me. Deliver me from the reproach of man, and I will keep your commandments. Make your face shine upon your servant, and teach me your judgments. My eyes are run down to rivers of water, because they do not keep your law. I am a fool. You are righteous, O Lord, and upright are your judgments. I have commanded your testimonies to be righteous, and your truth to be exceeding. The zeal of your house has eaten me up, because my enemies have despised your words. Your word is hot, and your servant loves it. I am young and weak, but I have not forgotten your judgments. Your righteousness is an everlasting righteousness, and your law is the truth. Trouble and distress have found me. Your commandments are my study. Your testimonies are righteous forever. Make me wise, and I shall live. I am deaf. I cried with all my heart. Hear me, O Lord. I will seek your judgments. I cried unto you. Save me, and I will keep your testimonies. I arose early and cried out. I hoped in your words. My eyes are open early, that they may meditate in your word. Hear my voice, O Lord, according to your mercy. Quicken me according to your judgment. My persecutors have drawn near with iniquity, but they are far from your law. You are near, O Lord, and all your commandments are truth. I have known from your testimonies of old that you have established them forever. O Lord, consider my affliction and deliver me, for I have not transgressed your law. Judge my cause and deliver me, for your word's sake quicken me. Far is the salvation of sinners, for they have not sought your judgments. Many are your tender mercies, O Lord. Quicken me according to your judgment. Many are my persecutors and oppressors, but I have not turned aside from your testimonies. I have seen those who are perverse, and I have heard that they do not keep your word. Behold, I have loved your commandments. O Lord, quicken me in your mercy. The beginning of your words is truth, and all your righteous judgments endure forever. Rulers have persecuted me without cause, but my heart trembles at your words. I rejoice at your words as one who finds many dogs. I hate and abhor injustice, but I love your law. 7 times a day I praise you for your righteous judgments. Great peace have those who love your law, and there is no stumbling block for them. I have sought your salvation, O Lord, and I have loved your commandments. My soul has kept your testimonies and loved them exceedingly. I have kept your commandments and your testimonies, for all my ways are before you, O Lord. Let my supplication come before you, O Lord. Uphold me according to your word. Let my right hand come before you. Uphold me according to your word. My lips shall utter a song when you teach me your statutes. My tongue shall speak your word, for all your commandments are righteousness. Let your hand be my salvation, for I have kept your commandments. I have longed for your salvation, O Lord, and your law is my meditation. My soul shall live, and it shall praise you, and your judgments shall help you. I have gone astray like a lost sheep. Seek your servant, for I have not kept your commandments. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. It is perhaps a waste of time to look for close continuity or any progress in the psalm. There is one all-pervading thought: the surpassing excellence of the law, coupled with the beauty and power of the psalm, lying in the unwearied reiteration of that single idea. There is a music in its monotony, which is subtly varied. Its verses are like the ripples on a sunny sea, alike and impressive in their continual march, and yet each catching the light in a different way, and breaking on the shore in their own tone. A few elements are combined into these 176 sentences. One or other of the usual synonyms for the law: your word, your saying, your statutes, commandments, testimonies, judgments, occurs in every verse except 122 and 132. The prayers, teach me, revive me, preserve me according to your word, and the vows I will keep, observe, meditate on, delight in your law, are constantly repeated. There are only a few pieces in our psalmist's kaleidoscope, but they fall into many shapes of beauty. And though all his sentences are moulded after the same general plan, the variety within such narrow limits is equally a witness of poetic power, which turns the fetters of the acrostic structure into helps, and of devout, heartfelt love for God's law. The psalm is probably of a later date, but its allusions to the singer's circumstances, be they taken as autobiography or having reference to the nation as a whole, are too vague to be used as clues as to the period of its composition. An earlier poet is unlikely to have adopted such an elaborate acrostic plan, and the praises of the law naturally suggest a time when it was familiar in an approximately complete form. It may be that the rulers referred to in 23 and 46 were foreign, but the expression is perhaps too general to draw a general conclusion from. It may be that the double-minded 113, who err from God's statutes 118 and forsake his law 153, are Israelites who have yielded to the temptations to apostasy, which came with the early Greek period, to which Bacon, Chain and others would assign the psalm. But these expressions also are of so general a nature that they cannot really give any definitive testimony as of date. The first three verses are closely connected. They set forth in general terms the elements of the blessedness of the doers of the law. To walk in it, in other words, to order the active life in conformity with its requirements, ensures perfection. To keep God's testimonies is at once the consequence and the proof of seeking him with the wholehearted devotion and determination. To walk in his ways is the preservative from evil doing. And such a man cannot be but blessed with a deep sacred blessedness which puts to shame coarse and turbulent delights and feeds its pure fires upon God himself. Whether these verses are taken as exclamation or declaration, they lead up naturally to verse 4, which reverently gazes upon the loving act of God in the revelation of his will in the law, and bethinks itself of the obligations bound upon us by that simple act. It is of God's mercy that he has commanded. And his words are meant to sway our wills, since he has broken the awful silence not merely to instruct, but to command, and nothing short of practical obedience could ever discharge our duties to this revelation. And so the psalmist betakes himself to prayer, that he might be helped to realize the purpose of God in giving the law. His contemplation of the blessedness of obedience and of the divine act of declaring his will moves him to longing, and his consciousness of weakness and wavering makes the longing into a prayer, that his wavering may be consolidated into a fixedness of purpose and continuity of obedience. When a man's ways are established to observe, they will be established by observing God's statutes. For nothing can put to the blush one whose eyes are directed to these. Whatever record leap to light, he shall never be ashamed. Nor will he cherish hopes that fail, nor desires that, when accomplished, are bitter of taste. To give heed to the commandments is the condition of learning them and recognizing how righteous they are. And such learning makes the learners hear righteousness like them and causes it to run over in thankfulness for the boon of knowledge of God's will. By all these thoughts, the psalmist is brought to his fixed resolve in verse 8 to do what God meant him to do when he gave the law, and what the singer has longed that he might be able to do, namely, to observe the statutes. But in his resolve he remembers also his weakness, and therefore he glides into prayer, for that presence without which resolves are only transient, abortive, and guaranteed to fail. The inference we can draw from verse 9 that the psalmist was a young man is a little precarious. For the language used would be quite appropriate also for an aged teacher desiring to guide an impetuous youth to sober self-control. While some verses favour the hypothesis of youth, 141 and 99 and 100, the tone of the whole, its rich experience and comprehensive grasp of the many relations of the law to life, imply a certain maturity of years and length of deep meditation. Surely the psalm is the ripe fruit of a life which is surely past its spring. But it is extremely questionable whether these apparently personal traits are indeed really so. Possibly the poet is thinking of the individuals of different ages and spiritual attainments who may use his words. The word rendered by taking heed has already occurred in verses 4 and 5. Observe. The careful study of the word must be accompanied with as careful study of self. The object observed there was the law. Here it is the man himself. Study God's law, says the psalmist, and then go and study yourself in its light. And so shall youthful impulses be bridled and life's path be kept pure. Surely this does not sound like a young man's thought, but more an old man's maxim, in which are crystallized a lifetime of rich experiences. The rest of the section intermingles petition, profession, and vows, and is deeply personal. The psalmist claims that he is one of those whom he has pronounced blessed, insofar as he has sought God with his whole heart. Such longing is no mere idle hope, but must be shown in obedience. As in verse 2, if a man longs for God, he will best find him by doing his will. But no heart's desire is so rooted as to guarantee that it shall not die, nor is past obedience a certain pledge of the same in the future. So the psalmist prays not in reliance upon his past, but in the dread that he may falsify it. Let me not wander. He had not only sought God in his heart, but had therein hid God's law as its best treasure, and as an inward power controlling and stimulating. Evil cannot flow from a heart in which God's law is lodged. That is the tree which sweetens the waters of the fountain. But the cry, "Teach me your statutes," would be but faltering if the singer could not rise above himself and take heart by gazing upon his God, whose own great character is the guarantee that he will not leave the seeking soul in ignorance. Professions and vows now take the place of petitions. From the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, and the word hidden in it will certainly not be concealed. It is buried deep that it may grow high. It is hidden that it may come abroad. And therefore, verse 13 tells us of bold utterance, which is as incumbent upon men as obedient deeds. A sane estimate of earthly good will put it decisively below the knowledge of God and of his will. Lives which despise what the world calls riches because they are smitten with the desire of any sort of wisdom are always nobler than those who keep the low level. And highest of all is the life which gives effect to its conviction that a man's true treasure is to know God's mind, and will to rejoice in his testimonies is to have wealth that can never be lost and pleasures that cannot wither. That glad estimate will surely lead to happy meditation upon them, by which their worth shall be disclosed and their sweep made plain. The miser loves to count his gold, but the saint to ponder his wealth in God. The same double direction of the mind already noted reappears in verse 15, where quiet meditation on God's statutes is associated with attention to the ways which are called his, as being pointed out by and pleasing to him, but ours, as being walked in by us. Inward delight in and practical remembrance of the law are vowed in 16, which covers the whole field of contemplative and active life. In verse 17, the psalmist desires continued life, mainly because it affords the opportunity of continued obedience. He will observe your word not only in token of gratitude, but because to him life is precious, chiefly because in its activities he is able to serve God. Such a reason for wishing to live may easily change to a willingness to die, as it did with Paul, who had learnt that a better obedience was possible when he had passed through the dark gates, and could therefore say, "To die is gain." Verses 18 and 19 are connected, insofar as the former desires subjective illumination and the latter objective revelation. Open eyes are useless if commandments are hidden, and the disclosure of the latter is in vain unless there are eyes open to see them. Two great truths lie in the former petition, namely that our spiritual vision is covered with scales which only God can take away, and that his revelation has in its depths truths and treasures which can only be discerned through his help. This cognate petition we find in verse 19 is based upon the pathetic thought that man is a stranger on earth, and therefore needs what will take away his sense of homelessness and unrest. All the other creatures are adapted to their environment, but he has a consciousness that he is an exile, a haunting, stinging sense which vaguely feels after repose in his native land. Thy commandments can still it. to know God's will with knowledge, which is acceptance and love, grants rest, and makes every place a mansion in the Father's house. We find possibly a connection between verses 20 and 21, the terrible fate of those who wander from the commandments, as described in the latter verse being the motive for the psalmist's longings expressed in the former. The judgments for which he longed with a yearning which seemed to bruise his soul are not, as might be supposed, God's judicial acts, but the word is a synonym for commandments, as we find elsewhere in the psalm. The last three verses of this section appear to be linked. They relate to the persecutions of the psalmist for his faithfulness to God's law. In verse 22, he prays that reproach and shame, which wrapped him like a covering, may be lifted from him, and his plea in the second part of 22 declares that he lay under these because he was true to God's statutes. In 23, we see the source of the reproach and shame in the conclave of men in authority, whether foreign princes or Jewish rulers, who were busy slandering him and plotting his ruin, while, with wonderful beauty, the contrasted picture in B shows the object of that busy talk, sitting silently absorbed in meditation on the higher things of God's statutes. As long as a man can do that, he has a magic circle drawn around him, across which fears and cares cannot step. Verse 24 heightens the impression of the psalmist's rest. Also, your testimonies are my delight, not only the subjects of his meditation, but bringing inward sweetness, though earth is in arms against him. And not only are they his delights, but the men of his counsel, in which he, solitary as he is, finds companionship, that arms him with resources against that knot of enemies who whisper against him. The exigencies of the acrostic plan are very obvious in this section. 5 of the verses of which begin with way or ways, and 2 of the remaining 3 with cleaves. But the variety secured under these circumstances is quite remarkable. The psalmist's soul cleaves to the dust. In other words, is bowed in mourning, but still, though thus darkened by sorrow and weeping itself away for grief, it cleaves to your testimonies. Verse 31. Happy in their sorrow are they who, by reason of the force which bows their sensitive nature, clings the more closely in their true selves to the declared will of God. Their sorrow appeals to God's heart, and is blessed if it dictates the prayer for his quickening. Verse 25. Their cleaving to his law warrants their hope that he will not put them to shame. The first pair of verses, in which way is the acrostic word, verse 26 and 27, sets my ways over against the way of your precepts. The psalmist has made God his confidant, telling him all his life story, and has found continual answers in gifts of mercy and inward whispers. He asks, therefore, for further illumination, which will be in accordance with these past mutual communications. Tell God your ways, and he will teach you his statutes. The franker our confession, the more fervent our longing for fuller knowledge of his will. The way of your precepts is the practical life according to these, the ideal which is going to rebuke and transform my ways. The singer's crooked course is spread before God, and he longs to see clearly the straight path of duty on which he vows that he is going to meditate and find wonders in the revelation of God's will. Many a sunbeam is wasted for the want of intent eyes. The prayer for understanding is vain without the vow of pondering. The next pair of way verses, 29 and 30, contrasts ways of lying and of faithfulness. In other words, sinful life which is false toward God and erroneous in its foundation maxims, and life which is true in practice to him and to a man's obligations. The psalmist prays that the former may be put far from him, for he feels that it is only too near, and his unaided feet too ready to enter upon it. He recognizes the inmost meaning of the law as an outcome of God's favour. It is not harsh, but glowing with love, God's best gift. The prayer in verse 29 has the psalmist's deliberate choice in verse 30 as its plea. That choice does not lift him above the need of God's help, and it gives him a claim thereupon. Our wills may seem fixed, but the gap between choice and practice is vast, and our feebleness alone cannot bridge it unless he strengthens us. And so the last verse of this section humbly vows to transform meditation and choice into action, and to run the way of God's commandments in thanksgiving for the joy with which, while the psalmist prays, he feels that his heart swells. Verses 33 and 34 are substantially identical in their prayer for enlightenment and their vow of obedience. Both are based on the conviction that outward revelation is incomplete without inward illumination. Both recognize the necessity of enlightened reason as a condition of obedient action, and such action as the test and issue of enlightenment. Both vow that knowledge will not remain barren. They differ in that the former verse pledges the psalmist to obedience unlimited in time, and the latter to obedience without reservation. But even in uttering his vow, the singer remembers his need of God's help to keep it, and turns it in verse 35 into a petition, which he significantly grounds on his heart's delight in the law. Warm as that delight may be, circumstance and flesh is going to cool it, and it is always a struggle to translate desire into deed. Therefore we need the sweet constraint of our divine helper to make us walk in the right way. Again, in verse 36, the preceding profession is caught up and modulated into profession. Incline my heart stands to in it I delight, just as make me walk does to I will observe it. Our purest joys in God and in his will depend on him for their permanence and increase. Our hearts are apt to spill their affection on the earth, even while we would bear the cup filled to God. And one chief rival of your testimonies is worldly gain, from which there must be forcible detachment, in order to and as accompaniment of attachment to God. All possessions which come between us and him are plunder, unjust gain. The heart is often led astray by the eye. The senses bring fuel to its unholy flames, and therefore the next petition we find in verse 37 asks that may be made, as it were, to pass on one side of temptation, which are branded as being vanity, of no substance or worth. However, they might glitter and solicit the gaze. To look longingly on earth's good makes us torpid in God's ways. To be earnest in the latter makes us dead to the former. There is but one real life for mankind, the life of union with God and of obedience to his commandments. And therefore the singer prays to be revived in God's ways. Experience of God's faithfulness to his plighted word will do much to deliver from earth's glamour, as verse 38 implies. The second clause is elliptical in Hebrew and is now usually taken as above, meaning that God's promise is fulfilled and leads men to reverence in him. But the rendering, who is devoted to your fear, is a little tenable. The reproach is probably that which would fall on the psalmist were he to be unfaithful to God's law. This interpretation gives a better meaning to the second part of the verse, which would then contain the reason for his desire to keep the judgments, i.e. the commandments, rather than the judicial acts, which he feels to be good. The section again ends with a constantly recurring strain: God's righteousness, his strict discharge of all obligations, guarantees that no longing turned to him will ever be left unsatisfied. The languishing desire will be changed into a fuller joy of more vigorous life, the necessary precursor of deeper draughts from the fountain of life is thirst for it, which faithfully turns aside from the earth's sparkling but drugged potions. There are in reality no Hebrew words that begin with the letter required as the initial to this section, except the copula and. Each verse begins with it, and it is best to retrain it in translation, however perverse it makes the language. The verses are aggregated rather than linked, and sometimes introduces a consequence, as in verse 42, and sometimes it is superfluous with regard to the sense, and so best omitted. A predominant reference to the duty of bearing witness to the truth runs throughout the section. The prayer in verse 41 for the visits of God's loving kindnesses, which in their sum make salvation and are guaranteed by his word of promise, is urged on the ground that by the experience of these, the psalmist will have his answer ready for all the carpers who scoff at him and his patient faith. Such a prayer is entirely in accord with the hypothesis that the speaker is the collective Israel, but not less so than the supposition that he is an individual. Whereas I was blind, now I see, is an argument that silences sarcasm. Verse 43 continues the thought of witnessing and asks that the word of truth, the law, is considered as disclosure of the truth rather than duty, and may not be snatched from a witness's mouth as it would be if God's promised loving kindnesses failed him. The condition of free utterance is rich experience. If prayers had gone up in vain from the psalmist's lips, no glad proclamation will be able to come from them. The verbs at the beginning of verses 44 and to 46 express what the psalmist would want to do and to some extent has already done. There can be no true faith without that longing for unbroken conformity with the manifest will of God. Whoever makes that deepest desire, seeking God's precepts, will walk at liberty, or at large, for restraints that are loved are not bonds, and freedom consists not in doing as I would, but in willing to do as I ought. Strong in such emancipation from the hindrances of one's own passions, and triumphant over external circumstances which may mould but not dominate a God-obeying life, the psalmist would rather open his mouth unabashed before the rulers. The kings spoken of in 46 may be foreign rulers, perhaps the representatives of the Persian monarch, or even later alien sovereigns. Or maybe the expression is just general, and the speaker be a private person who feels his courage rising as he enters into the liberty of perfect submission. Verses 47 to 48 are general expressions of delight in the law. Lifting the hand toward the commandments seems to be a figure of reverent regard, or longing, as one wistfully stretches them out towards some dear person or thing that we would want to draw closer. The phrase, which I love, in verse 48 overloads the clause and is perhaps a scribe's erroneous repetition of the previous verse. In this section, there is only one verse of petition, the others being mainly avowals of adherence to the law in the face of continued trial. The single petition we find in 49 pleads the relation of servant, as giving a claim on the great Lord of the household, and deduces God's having encouraged hope, as imposing upon him an obligation to fulfil it. Expectations fairly deduced from his word are prophets of their own realization. In 50, this points to the fact in the second part, namely that the word had already proven its power in the past by quickening the psalmist to new courage and hope, declaring that remembered experience solaces his present sorrow. A heart that has been revived by life-giving contact with the word has a hidden warmth beneath the deepest snows and cleaves the more to that word. 51 to 53 describe the attitude of the lover of the law in the presence of the ungodly. He is as unmoved by shafts of ridicule as by the heavier artillery of slander and plot. To be laughed out of one's faith is even worse than to be terrified out of it. The lesson is not needless in a day when adherence and obedience to the word are smiled at in so many quarters as indicating an inferior intelligence, a weakness of mind. The psalmist held fast to it, and while laughter with more than a trace of bitterness rang around him, threw himself back on God's ancient and enduring words, which made the scoffs sound hollow and transient. Verse 52. Righteous indignation, too, rises in a devout soul at the sight of men's departure from God's law. 53. The word rendered fiery anger is found also in Psalm 11:6 and is best taken as above, though some would render it horror. The wrath was not unmingled with compassion, as we find in 136, and whilst it is clearly an emotion belonging to the Old Testament rather than the Christian type of devotion, it should be present, in a softened form perhaps, in our feelings towards evil. In verse 54, the psalmist turns from the gainsayer. He strikes again the note of verse 19, calling earth his place of a transient abode, or, as we might say, his inn. The brevity of life would be crushing had God not spoken to us. And since he has, the pilgrims could march with songs and everlasting joy upon their heads, and all about their moving camp the sound of song might echo. To its lovers, God's law is not harsh and crabbed, but as musical as is Apollo's lute. The psalm is one of the poet's songs. Even those of us who are not singers can and should meditate on God's law, until its melodious beauty is disclosed and its commandments, that sometimes sound stern, set themselves to rhythm and harmony. As God's words took bitterness out of the thought of mortality, so his name remembered in the night brought light into darkness, whether physical nor other. We often lose our memory of God and our hold on his hand, when in sorrow and in grief sometimes think that it was a dispensation from obedience. And so we shall be the better for remembering the psalmist's experience and should, like him, cling to the name in the dark, and then we shall have light enough to observe your law. Verse 56. Looking back on the mingled life of good and evil, of which some of the sorrows have just been touched, and speaking of deep contentment with its portion. Whatever else may be withheld or withdrawn, that lot is blessed which has been helped by God to keep his precepts, and they are happy and wise who deliberately prefer that good to all worldly. Verse 57 goes on to the root of the matter in setting out the resolve of obedience as the resolve of a consciousness of possessing God. He who feels in his own happy heart that Jehovah is his portion will be moved thereby to vow to keep his words. The psalmist had learnt the evangelical lesson that he did not win God by keeping the law, but that he was moved to keep the law because he had won God. He had also learnt the companion truth that the way to retain that possession is obedience. Verse 58 corresponds in some measure to verse 57. But the order of the clauses is inverted, stating the psalmist's prayer, as in 57b, did his resolve, and in part B, building on his cry to God to be truly his portion and bestow his favour upon him. But the true ground of our hope is not our most wholehearted prayer, but God's promise. The following 5 verses change from the key of petition to that of profession and obedience to and delight in the law. The fruit of wise consideration of one's conduct is willing acceptance of God's law as his witness of what is right for us. The only ways which sober consideration will approve are those marked out in mercy by him, and meditation on conduct is worthless if it does not issue in turning our feet into these. Without such meditation, we are going to end up wandering on byways and become lost. Want of thought will ruin a man, verse 59. But such turning of our feet to the right road has many foes, and chief among them is to linger and delay. And therefore resolve must never be cool, but be carried out swiftly into action, verse 60. The world is full of snares, and they lie thick around our feet whenever these are turned toward God's ways. The only means of keeping them clear is to fix heart and mind on God's law and to look and focus our gaze upon him. Then we shall be able to pick our steps confidently between the traps and the pits, verse 61. Physical weariness limits obedience, and needful sleep relaxes the nervous tension, so that many a strenuous worker and noble aspirant fails beneath his daylight self in wakeful night seasons. Blessed are those who in the night see visions of God and meditate on his law, not on earthly vanities or aims. 62. Society has its temptations, as has solitude. The man whose heart has fed in secret on God and his law will naturally gravitate towards like-minded people. Our relation to God and his uttered will should determine our affinities with man, and it is a bad sign indeed when natural impulses do not draw us to those who fear God. Two men who have that fear in common are like each other in their deepest selves, however different they may be in other respects. Either of them is to those to whom he is like in surface characteristics, and unlike in this supreme trait. Verse 63. One pathetic petition closes the section. In verse 19, the psalmist had based his prayer for illumination on his being a stranger on earth. But here he grounds it on the abundance of God's loving kindness which floods the world. It is the same plea, but in a different form, for all creatures bask in the light of God's love, which falls on each in a manner appropriate to its need. Man's supreme need is the knowledge of God's statutes. Therefore the same all-embracing mercy, which cares for those happy, careless creatures, will not be implored in vain to satisfy his nobler and more pressing want. All beings get their respective boons unasked. But the preeminence of ours is partly seen in this, that it cannot be given without the cooperation of our desire, and it will be given wherever that condition is fulfilled. Verse 64. The restrictions of the acrostic structure are very obvious in this section, 5 of the 8 verses of which begin with good. The epithet is first applied in verse 65 to the whole of God's dealings with the psalmist. To the devout soul all life is of one piece, and its submission and faith exercise a transmuting power on pains and sorrows, so that the psalmist might say, "Let one more give witness that I have lived and seen God's hand through a lifetime, and all was for best." The epithet is next applied in verse 66 to the perception or taste or faculty of discernment of good and evil, for which the psalmist prays, basing his petition on the belief of God's word. Swift, sure, and delicate apprehension of right and wrong comes from such belief. The heart in which it reigns is sensitive, like a goldsmith's scales or a thermometer which visibly sinks when a cloud passes before the sun. The instincts of faith work surely and rapidly. The settled judgment that life had been good includes apparent evil, verse 67, which is real evil insofar as it pains, but is, in a deeper view, good, insomuch as it scourges the wandering heart, bringing it back to true obedience, and therefore to well-being. The words of verse 67 are especially appropriate as the utterance of the Israel purified from idolatry by captivity, but may also be the expression of the psalmist's own individual experience. The epithet is next applied to God himself in verse 68. How steadfast a gaze into the depths of the divine nature and over the broad field of divine activity is in that short, all-including clause, containing but 3 words in the Hebrew: good are you and doing good. The prayer built on it is the one which continually recurs in this psalm and is reached by many paths. Every view of a man's condition, be it bright or dark, and every thought of God bring the psalmist to the same desire. Here, God's character and beneficence, widespread and continual, prompt the prayer, both because the knowledge of his will is our highest good, and because a good God cannot but wish his servants to be more like himself, in loving righteousness and hating iniquity. Verses 69 and 70 are a pair, setting forth the antithesis frequent in the psalm between an evil man's conduct to the psalmist and his tranquil contemplation of and delight in God's precepts. False slanders buzz about him, but he cleaves to God's law and is conscious of his own innocence. Men are dull and insensible, as if their hearts were waterproofed with a layer of grease through which no gentle rain from heaven could ever steal. But the psalmist is all the more led to open his heart to the gracious influences of that law, because others close theirs. If a bad man is not made worse by surrounding evil, he is made better by it. Just as in verses 65 and 68, the same thought of God's goodness is expressed in 71, repeating the thought of 67, just with a slight deepening. There the beneficence of sorrow was simply declared as a fact. Here it is thankfully accepted with full submission and consent of the will. Good for me means not only good in fact, but in my opinion. The repetition of the phrase at the beginning of the next verse throws light on its meaning. The singer thinks that he has 2 real good things, preeminent amongst the uniform sequence of such, and these are first his sorrows, which he considers to be a blessing, because they have helped him to a firmer grasp of the other, the real good of every man, the law which is sacred and venerable, because it has come from the lips of the deity himself. That is indeed our true wealth. Happy those whose estimate of it correspond to its real worth, and who have learnt by their affliction, or anyhow that material riches are dross, compared with its solid preciousness. Prayer for illumination is confined to the first and last verses of this section, the rest of which is mainly occupied with petitions and of the psalmist's love of the law, with encouragement to others to trust which are derived from his own experience. Verse 73 puts forcefully the thought that man is evidently an incomplete fragment, unless the gift of understanding can be infused into his material frame. God has begun to shape it, and therefore is pledged to continue to bestow spiritual discernment should his creature ask for it. But that prayer will only be answered if the suppliant intends to use the gift for its correct purpose of learning God's statutes. Verse 74 prays that the psalmist may be a witness that the hope in his word is never in vain, and so that his deliverances may be the occasion of widespread gladness. God's honour is involved in answering his servant's trust. Verses 75 to 77 are linked together. The judgments in 75 seem to mean here providential acts, not as generally in this psalm the law. The acknowledgement of the justice and faithfulness which sends sorrow precedes the two verses of petition for loving kindness and compassion. Sorrows sting and burn, and they're recognised as sent in love, and the tried heart yearns for these other messengers to come from God to sustain and soothe God's promise, and the psalmist's delight in God's law are the double ground of twin petitions. Then follow 3 verses which are discernibly connected as expressing desires in regard to the proud, the devout, and the psalmist himself. He prays that the first might be shamed, that their deceitfulness or causeless hostility may be balked, and, as in some other cases, contrasts his own peaceful absorption in the law with their plotting. He repeats the prayer of 74 with a slight difference, asking that his deliverance may draw attention to him, and that others may, from contemplating his security, come to know the worth of God's testimonies. In the second part of 79, the text reads that they shall know, as the result of observation, which the Hebrew margin needlessly alters into those who know. For himself, he prays that his heart may be sound, or thoroughly devoted to keep the law, and then he is sure that nothing shall ever put him to shame. Who is he that will harm you if you are zealous for what is good? Section overall has more than its usual continuity. The psalmist is persecuted, and in these 8 verses pours out his heart to God. Taken as a whole, they make a wonderful picture of a patient endurance and a submissive longing. Intense and protracted yearning for deliverance has wasted his very soul, but has not merged in impatience or unbelief, for he has waited for your word. His eyes have ached with straining for the signs of approaching comfort, the coming of which he has never doubted, but the delay of which has tried his faith. This longing has been quickened by troubles, which have wrapped him around like pungent smoke wreaths eddying among the rafters, where disused wineskins hang and get blackened and wrinkled. So it has been with him, but through all he has kept hold of God's statutes, and so he plaintively reminds God of the brevity of his life, which has so short a tale of days that judgment on his persecutors must be swift, if it is to be of any use. Verses 85 to 87 describe the busy hostility of his foes. It is truculently contrary to God's law, and therefore, as is implied, worthy of God's counter-working. The second part of 85 is best taken as a further description of the proud, which is spread before God as a reason for his judicial action. The antithesis between 86, the faithfulness of the law and the lying of the persecutor, is the ground of the prayer. Help me. Even in extreme peril, when he was all but made away with, the psalmist still clung to God's precepts, 87. And so he is heartened to pray for revival, and to vow that men, bound by new chains of gratitude, he will more than ever observe God's testimonies. This measure of the new wine poured into the shriveled wineskin is nothing less than the measureless loving kindness of God, and nothing but experience of his benefits melts to obedience. The stability of nature gives witness to the steadfastness of the word which sustains it. The universe began and continues because God puts forth his will. The heavens with their pure depths would collapse, and all the stars would flicker into darkness, if the uttered God will did not echo throughout their overwhelming spaces. The solid earth would not be solid but for God's power immanent within it. Heaven and earth are so in this way his servants. In verse 91, we see a possible picture of them standing waiting for your ordinances, but the indefinite preposition is probably better regarded as equivalent to in accordance with. The psalmist has reached the grand notion of the universal reign of God's law, and of the continual putting forth of God's will as the sustaining energy of all things. And he seeks to link himself to that great band of God's servants, to be in harmony with star and storm, with earth and ocean, as their fellow servant. And yet he feels that his relation to God's law is closer than theirs, for he can find delight in that which they unconsciously obey. Such delight in God's uttered will changes affliction from foe, threatening life, to a friend, ministering strength, verse 92. Nor does that law, when loved, only avert destruction. It also increases vitality, 93, and reinvigorates the better self. There is a sense in which the law can give life, we find in Galatians 3, but it must be welcomed and enshrined in the heart in order to be able to do so. The recurring prayer for salvation has a double plea in 94. The soul that has yielded itself to God in joyful obedience thereby establishes a claim upon him. He cannot but protect his own possessions, for ownership brings obligation, which he recognizes. The second plea is drawn from the psalmist's seeking after God's precepts, without which seeking there would be no reality in his profession of being God's. To seek them is the sure way to find both them and salvation, verse 94. The one whom God saves, enemies will try in vain to destroy, and even though they lurk in waiting to spring upon the psalmist, his eyes are directed not toward them, but toward God. To give heed to these is the sure way to escape snares. Verse 94. Lifelong experience has taught the psalmist that there is a flaw in every human excellence, a limit soon reached and never passed to all that is noblest in man. But high above all achievements and stretching beyond present vision is the fair ideal bodied forth in the law. Since it is God's commandment, it will not always be an unreached ideal, but may be indefinitely approximated to. And to contemplate it will be a joy when we learn that it is prophecy because it is also commandment. One thought overrides this section, and that is that the law is the fountain of sweet wisdom. The rapture of love with which it opens is sustained throughout. The psalmist knows that he is not merely more wisdom of the same sort as his enemies, his teachers and the aged have, but wisdom of a better kind. His foes were wise in craft, and his teachers drew their instruction from earthly springs. The elders had learnt that bitter worldly wisdom, which had been disillusioned of her youth's unsuspectingness and dreams, but without being thereby led to grasp that which is no illusion. But the heart which simply keeps to the law reaches, in its simplicity, an infinitely higher truth than these know, and has an instinctive discernment of good and evil. Worldly wisdom is transient. Where there is knowledge, it shall be done away. But the wisdom that comes with the commandment is enduring. Verse 98. Meditation must be accompanied with practice in order to make the true wisdom one's own. The depths of the testimonies must be surrounded by patient brooding upon them, and then the knowledge won must be carried into act. To do what we know is the sure way to know it better, and to know more, 99 to 100, and that positive obedience has to be accompanied by abstinence from evil. For in such a world as this shalt thou not is the necessary preliminary to thou shalt. The psalmist has a better teacher than those whom he has outgrown. Even God himself, and his instruction has a graciously constraining power, which keeps his conscious soldiers upon the right path. 102. These thoughts draw another exclamation from the poet, who feels, as he reflects upon his blessings, that the law ceases to be harsh and is delightsome as well as health-giving. It is promise as well as law, for God will help us to be what he commands us to be. Those who love the lawgiver will find sweetness in his law. 103. This is the blessed effect of the wisdom which it gives, that it makes us quick to detect sophistries, which tempt us into forbidden paths and fill us with a wholesome detestation. A lamp is for the night, whereas a light shines in the day. The word is both to the psalmist. His antithesis may be equivalent to a comprehensive declaration that the law is light of every sort, or it may be intended to lay stress on the varying phases of experience and to turn our thoughts to that word which will gleam guidance in darkness and shine a better sun in bright hours. The psalmist's choice, not merely the inherent power of the law, is expressed in 105. He has taken it for his guide, or, as we read in 106, has sworn and kept his oath, that he would observe the righteous decisions which would point his foot upon the true path. The affliction bemoaned in 107 is probably the direct result of the conduct professed in 106. The prayer for revival, which means deliverance from outward evils rather than necessarily a spiritual quickening, is therefore presented with confidence and based upon the many promises in the word of help to sufferers for righteousness. Whatever our affliction, there is ease in telling God about them, and if our desires for his help are according to your word, they will be as willing to accept help as to bear as help, which removes the sorrow and thus will not be offered without an answer. That cry for reviving is best understood as being the free will offerings, which the psalmist prays might be accepted. Happy in their afflictions are they whose chief desire, even then, is to learn more of God's statutes. They will find that their sorrows are their best teachers. If we wish most to make advances in his school, we shall not complain of the guides to whom he has committed us. Continual alarms and dangers tend to foster a disregard of duty, as truly does the opposite state of unbroken security. A man absorbed in keeping himself alive is apt to think he has no attention to spare for God's law. The one ringed about by traps is apt to take circuits to avoid them, even at the cost of divergence from the path marked out by God. Verse 110. But even in such compelling circumstances, the psalmist did what all good men must do, and deliberately chose his portion and found God's law better than any outward good, as being able to diffuse deep, sacred and perpetual joy through all his inner nature. A heart filled in this way with serene gladness is thereby drawn to perform God's statutes with a lifelong persistency, and the heart thus inclined to obedience has tapped the sources of equally enduring joy. The section is mainly the expression of firm resolve to cleave to the law. Continuity may be traced in it, seeing as verses 113 to 115 breathe love and determination, passing on in 116 to 17 into prayer. In view of the psalmist's weakness and the strength of temptation, while 118 to 120 demonstrate the fate of the despisers of the law and intensify the psalmist's clinging grasp of awe-struck love. Hatred of the double-minded who waver between God and idol and are weak accordingly rests upon, and in its turn increases, wholehearted adherence to the law. It is a tepid devotion to it which does not strongly recoil from lives that water down its precepts and try to walk on both sides of the way at the same time. Whoever has taken God for his defence can afford to bide God's time for fulfilment of his promises. 114. The natural results of such a love to and are waiting for his word are resolved separation from the society of those whose lives are moulded upon opposing principles, and the ordering of external relations in accordance with the supreme purpose of keeping the commandments of him to whom love and waiting claim as my God. 115. But resolve will melt in the fire of temptation, and the psalmist knows life and himself too well to trust himself. So he betakes himself to prayer for God's upholding, without which he cannot hope to live. And this is a hope built on God's promise that has a claim over him, and being put to shame and disappointment would be a dishonour to God. 116. The psalmist knows that his wavering will can only be fixed by God, and that experience of his sustaining hand will make a stronger bond between God and him than anything else could ever. The consciousness of salvation must precede steadfast regard to the precepts of the God who saves. In 117. To stray from the law is ruin, as is described in 118 and 119. They who wander are despised or made light of, for their deceit is a lie. The hopes and plans with which they deceive themselves are false. It is a gnarled way of saying that all godless life is a blunder, as well as a sin, and is fed with unrealistic promises. Dross is flung away when the metal is extracted. Slag from the furnace is hopelessly useless, and the psalmist thinks that the wicked of the earth are thrown as rubbish to the void. He is not contemplating a future life, but God's judgments as manifested here in providence, and his faith is assured that even here the process is visible, and therefore gazing upon the fate of the evildoer, his flesh creeps and every particular hair stands on end. His dread is full of love, and love is full of dread. Profoundly are the two emotions yoked together in 119 and 120. I love your testimonies, and of your judgments I am afraid. One explanation fixes on the literal meaning of the word goings up and points to its use in the singular for the return from Babylon that we read in Ezra 7 verse 9, as supporting the view that these were psalms sung by the returning exiles. There is much in the group of songs to favour this view, but then against the fact we have Psalm 122 1-9 and 134 1-3, which imply the existence of the temple and the fully organised ceremonial worship therein. A third solution is that the name refers to the structure of the psalms, which have a step-like progressive rhythm. This is the explanation of Genesius, adopted by Delitzsch, but the peculiar structure in question, even though it's obvious in several of the psalms, is scarcely perceptible in others, and is entirely absent from Psalm 132. The remaining explanation of the title is perhaps the most probable, that the goings up were those of worshippers travelling to Jerusalem for the feasts. This little collection is, then, the songbook for the pilgrims, a designation to which its contents well correspond. The thoughts of evildoers tinges most of the section, and it opens with a triplet of verses occasioned by their oppressions of the psalmist, and closes with a triplet occasioned by their breaches of the law. In the former, he is conscious that he has followed the judgment or the law of God, and so hopes that he will not be abandoned to his foes. The consciousness and the hope equally need limitation to correspond with true estimates of ourselves and with facts, for there is no absolute fulfilment of the law, and good men are often left to be footballs for bad ones. But in the depths the confidence is true. Precisely because he had it, the psalmist prays that it may be vindicated by fact. Be surety for your servant, a profound image drawn from legal procedure in which one man becomes security for another and makes good any deficiencies. And so God will stand between the hunted and the foe, undertaking for him, "You shall answer, Lord, for me." How much the fulfilment in Christ has exceeded this desire of the psalmist. Their oppressor's wrong had lasted long, and the singer's weary eyes had been strained in looking for the help which seemed to tarry, and that fainting gaze humbly appealed to God. Will he not end this wistful watching quickly? 124 and 5 are a pair, the psalmist's relation of servant being adduced in both as the ground for his prayer for instruction. But they do differ in that the former verse lays stress on the consonance of such instruction with God's loving kindness, and the second on its congruity with the psalmist's position and character as his servant. God's best gift is the knowledge of his will, which he will surely never withhold from spirits who will to serve, if only they knew how. Verses 126 to 128 are closely linked. The psalmist's personal wrongs melt into that wider thought of wickedness which does its little best to make void the sovereign steadfast law. Delitzsch would have it that it says it's time to work for Jehovah, and the meaning obtained in this way is a worthy one, but that given in our translation is more in accordance with the context. It is bold, and it would be audacious if a prayer did not underline the statement, to undertake to determine when evil has reached such a height as to demand immediate punishment from God. But however slow we should be to prescribe to him the when or the how of his intervention, we may learn from the psalmist's emphatic therefores, which stand coordinately at the beginning of 127 and 128, that the more men make void the law, the more God's servants should praise it, and the more they should bind its precepts upon their moral judgment, and heartily loathe all paths, which, specious as they may be, are paths of falsehood, though the world may avow that they are true. Devout souls do not take offence at the depths and difficulties of God's word, but are thereby drawn to a more intense contemplation of them. We grow weary of the trivial and the obvious. That which tasks and outstrips our powers attracts. But the obscurity should not be arbitrary but inherent, a clear obscure, like the depths of a pure sea. These wonderful testimonies give light, notwithstanding, or rather because of their wonderfulness. And it is the simple heart, not the sharpened intellect, that can penetrate into them and find the light most surely. Verse 130. And so the psalmist longs for God's commandments, like a wild creature panting, open-mouthed for water. He puts to shame our indifference. If his longing was not excessive, how defective is ours? Verse 132, like 122, has no particular allusion to the law, although the word rendered in it right is that used in the psalm for the law considered as judgments. The prayer is a bold one, pleading for what is justly due to the lovers of God's name. Kay quotes, God is not unrighteous to forget your work and labour of love, which you have showed to his name. Hebrews 6:10. But one would have expected the law instead of name in the last word of the verse. And possibly the concept of law may be, as it were, latent in name, for the latter does carry it in the imperative commandments and plain revelation of duty. God's name holds the law in seed. The law is by the expansion of the name. Promise in verse 133 must be taken in a wider sense as including all of God's revealed will. The only escape from the tyranny of sin is to have our steps established by God's word, and his help is needed for such establishment. Rebellion against sin's dominion is already victory over it, if the rebel summons to God's heavenly reinforcements to his help. It is high attainment to desire deliverance from men, chiefly in order to observe unhindered God's commandments. It is as high a desire to seek the light of God's face, mainly as the means of seeing his will more clearly. The psalmist did not merely wish for outward prosperity or inward cheer and comfort, but that these might contribute to fulfilling his deepest wish of learning better what God would have him do. Verse 135. The moods of indignation that we have seen in verse 53 and of hatred, 104, 113 and 128, have given place to a softer emotion, as they always should, 136. Tears and pity should mingle with righteous anger, as when Jesus looked around them with anger, being with the anger grieved at the hardening of their heart. Mark 3:5. The first word suggested to the psalmist under this letter is righteousness. That august concept was grasped by devout Israelites with a tenacity and assumed a prominence in their thoughts unparalleled elsewhere. It is no mere yielding to the requirements of the acrostic structure which sets that great word in 4 of the 8 verses of the section 137 to 144. 2 thoughts are common to them all: that righteousness has its seat in the chest of God, and that the law is the true transcript of all that divine righteousness. These things being so, it follows that the law is given to men in accordance with the divine faithfulness. In other words, in remembrance of discharge of obligations which God has undertaken to them. Nor less certainly does it follow that the law, which is the irradiation of God's righteousness, is eternal, as is its fontal source. The beam must last as long as the sun. No doubt there are transient elements in the law which the psalmist loved, but its essence must be everlasting, because its origin is God's everlasting righteousness. So absorbed is he in adoring contemplation of it, that he even forgets to pray for help to keep it, and it is not until we reach 144 that he asks for understanding that he might live. True life is in the knowledge of the law by which God is known, as Jesus has taught us that to know the only true God is life eternal. A faint gleam of immortal hope perhaps shines in that prayer, for if the testimonies are forever and the knowledge of them is life, it cannot be that they shall outlast the soul that knows and lives by them. One more characteristic of God's righteous testimonies is celebrated in verse 140, namely that they have stood sharp tests, and like metal in the furnace, have not been dissolved but brightened by the heat. They have been tested when the psalmist was afflicted, and found them to hold true. The same fire tried him and them, and he does not glorify his own endurance, but the promise which enabled him to endure. The remaining verses of the section describe the psalmist's afflictions and clinging to the law. Verse 139 recurs to his emotions on seeing men's neglect of it. Zeal here takes the place of grief in 136, and of indignation and hatred. Friction against widespread godlessness generates a flame of zeal, as it should always do. Small and despised was Israel among the great powers of the ancient world, but he who meditates on the law is armed against contempt and contented in insignificance. Distress and anguish may surround him, but hidden springs of delight well up in the heart that cleaves to the law, like fresh outbursts of fresh water rising to the surface of a salt sea. The next 2 verses are a pair in which former prayers for deliverance and vows of obedience are recalled and again repeated. The tone of supplication prevails throughout the section. The cries presented are no new things. The psalmist's habit has been prayer, always wholehearted, always continued, and always accompanied with the resolve to keep by obedience and to observe with sharpened watchfulness the utterances of God's will. Another pair of verses follow, 147 and 148, which recall the singer's wakeful devotion. His voice rose to God ere the dim morning broke, and his heart kept itself in submission. His eyes saw God's promises shining in the darkness and making meditation better than sleep. The petitions of 149 may be taken as based upon the preceding pairs. The psalmist's patient continuance gives him ground to expect an answer. But the true ground is God's character, as witnessed by his deeds of loving kindness and his revelation of his judgments in the law. Another pair of verses follows, 150-51, in which the hostile nearness of the psalmist's foes, gathering around him with malign purpose, is significantly contrasted, both with their remoteness in temperament from the character enjoined in the law, and with the yet closer proximity of the assailed man's defender. He who has God near him, and who realizes that his commandments are truth, can look untremblingly on mustering masses of enemies. This singer had learnt that before danger threatened. The last verse of the section breathes the same tone of long-continued and habitual acquaintance with God and his law as the earlier pairs of verses do. The convictions of a lifetime were too deeply rooted to be disturbed by such a passing storm. There is, as it were, a calm smile of triumphant certitude in that long ago. Experience teaches that the foundation laid for trust as well as for conduct in the law is far too stable to be moved, and we need not fear to build our wall upon it. So let us build rock on that rock and answer God's everlasting testimonies with our own unwavering reliance and submission. The prayer, "Revive me," occurs 3 times in this section. It is not a petition for spiritual quickening so much as for a removal of calamity, which restrained free, joyous life. Its repetition accords with the other characteristics of the section, which is markedly a cry from a burdened heart. The psalmist finds himself in affliction. He is, as it were, the defendant in a suit, a captive needing a strong avenger, 154, compassed around by a swarm of enemies, 157, forced to endure the sight of the faithless and to recoil from them, 158. His thoughts vibrate between his needs and God's compassion, between his own cleaving to the law and its grand comprehensiveness and perpetuity. His prayer now is not for fuller knowledge of the law, but for rescue from his troubles, and it is worthwhile to follow his swift turns of thought, which in their windings are shaped by the double sense of need and of divine fullness. First come 2 plaintive cries for rescue, based in one case on his adherence to the law and in the other on God's promise. Then his eye turns on those who do not, like him, seek God's statutes and those which he pronounces, with solemn depth of insight, to be so far from salvation which he feels is his, because they have no desire to know God's will. That is a pregnant word. Swiftly he turns from these unhappy ones to gaze on the multitude of God's compassions, which hearten and encourage him to repeat his prayer for revival according to God's judgments. In other words, his decisions contained in the law. But again, his critical position in the midst of his enemies forces itself into remembrance, and he can only plead that in spite of them he has held fast by the law, and when compelled to see apostasy has felt no temptation to join them, but a wholesome loathing of all departure from God's word. That loathing was the other side of his love. The more closely we cleave to God's precepts, the more shall we recoil from the thoughts and lives which fled them. And then the psalmist looks up wistfully once more and asks that his love may receive what God's loving kindness emboldens it to look for as its result, namely the revival which he once again craves. That love or the law has led him into the depths of an understanding of God's word, and so his lowly petitions swell into the declaration, which he has verified in life, that its sum total is truth and the perpetual possession for loving hearts, however ringed around by enemies and weighed upon by sore distress. The tone of the next part is in striking contrast. Here, with the exception of the first clause of the first verse, all is sunny, and the thunder clouds are far down over the horizon. Joy, peace, and hope breathe throughout the song. Beautifully are reverential awe and exuberant gladness blended contemporaneously, as results of a listening to God's word. There is a rapture in the awe. There is awe in that bounding gladness. To possess that law is better than to win rich booty. The spoils of the conflict which we wage in our own negligence or disobedience are our best wealth. The familiar connection between a love of the law and a hatred of lives which depart from it, are therefore lies and built on lies, reappears, yet not as the ground of prayer for help, but as part of the blessed treasures which the psalmist recounts. His life is accompanied by the music of perpetual praise. 7 times a day, in other words, unceasingly, his glad heart breaks into song, and the overcome of his song is ever God's righteous judgment. His own experience gives assurance of the universal truth that the love of God's law secures peace, just as such love brings the heart into contact with absolute God, inasmuch as submission to God's will is always peace. In the same way the fountain of unrest is dried up, as all outward things are allies of such a heart and serve the soul that served God. Such love saves us from falling over the stumbling blocks and enables a man to walk firmly and safely on the clear path of duty. Like the dying Jacob, such a man waits for God's salvation, patiently expecting that each day will bring its own form of help and deliverance, and his waiting is no idle anticipation, but full of strenuous obedience, verse 166, and of watchful observance, such as the eyes of a servant directed to his master. Love makes such a man keen to take note of the slightest indication of God's will, and eager to serve them all. 167 and 168. All this joyous profession of the psalmist's happy experience as he spreads humbly before God, appealing to him whether it is true. He is not flaunting his self-righteousness in God's face, but gladly recounting to God's honour all the spoil that he has found, because he has penetrated into the law and it has penetrated his inmost being. The threads that have run through the psalm are firmly knotted together in this closing section, which falls into 4 pairs of verses. In the first verse, the manifold preceding petitions are concentrated in 2 for understanding and deliverance, the twin needs of man, which the one covers the whole ground of inward illumination and the other comprises all good for outward life, while both are in accordance with the large confidence warranted by God's faithfulness. And petition then passes into praise. The psalmist instinctively obeys the command. By prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known. His lips give forth not only shrill cries of need, but well up songs of thanks. While 1,000 mercies impel the sparkling flood of praise, the chief of these is God's teaching him his righteous statutes, 171 and 2. In the following pair of verses, the emphasis lies not on the prayer for help, so much as on the grounds the psalmist's deliberate choice of God's precepts, his patient yearning for God's salvation, and his delight in the law, all of which characteristics have been over and over again professed throughout the psalm. And here, once more, they are amassed together not in self-righteousness, but as making it credible that God, being the faithful and merciful God which he is, his hand should hang idle while his servant cries for help. And the final pair of verses sets out the relations of the devout soul with God in their widest and most permanent form. The true life of the soul must come from him, the fountain of life. A true soul thus made to live by communion with and derivation of life from God lives to praise, and all its motions are worship. To it the law is no menace nor unwelcome restriction. It is a helper, it is a lifeblood, life drawn from God, turned to God in continual praise and invigorated by unfailing help, ministered through his unuttered will, is the only life worth living. It is granted to all who ask for it. But a lower, sadder note must ever mingle in our prayers. Aspiration and trust must also be intertwined with a consciousness of our own weakness and distrust of ourselves. Only those who are ignorant of the steps of the soul's pilgrimage to God can wonder about the psalmist's last thoughts about himself, blending confession of wandering like a straying sheep and profession of not forgetting God's commandments. Both phrases of consciousness coexist in the true servant of God, as alas, both have grounds in his experience. But our sense of having wandered should always be accompanied with the tender thought that the lost sheep is a sheep beloved and sought for by the great shepherd, in whose search, not in our own docile following of his footsteps, lies our firmest hope. The psalmist prayed, "Seek your servant," for he knew how continually he would be tempted and would indeed fall. But we know better than he did how wonderfully the answer has surpassed the petition. The Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Wherever you may be, and whenever you may listen to this message, may the good Lord Almighty bless you and keep you safe, secure in faith and love, in the certainty of eternal life now and forevermore. Amen.